was going in the other direction.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What are you guys doing? Your last day of school this week.
Woo!
Okay, so before we start this morning, two things. Number one, I hope you all have a delightful Thanksgiving. I've always thought it was the best meal of the year, especially if one just had to eat it rather than cook it and clean up afterwards.
Not me.
If I would say P.S. on that, help your parents. They will appreciate it, because if they are making a traditional Thanksgiving dinner with lots of people, or even, a handful of people, it's a lot of work, and they will appreciate it even if you only help for 15 or 20 minutes. Or maybe your parents will just say, you clean it up. Okay, that's number one. Number two, we're going to finish the federal bureaucracy very, very quickly here and get into the federal courts. And I want to emphasize that what we ended talking about last class, and what we're going to review again, especially with respect to sub-governments, policy complexes, or iron triangles, whatever you want to call them, is at least as important as anything else that you should take away from an American government introductory course. And the reason why is because these are essentially informal but relatively permanent structures of relationships between diverse actors working within specialized public policy areas. If you wish to understand public policy, if you wish to understand what the American national government does in terms of any public policy area, if you do not understand this, you do not understand anything. It's really that bold and that simple. So, we left off talking about the iron triangles, and again, here's the image that I put together. I grant you that I'm not the best image maker, but what we're talking about is specialized policy areas where policy gets made, government policy gets made in a series of relationships in these specialized policy areas between executive branch agencies, congressional committees and subcommittees that have jurisdiction over those specialized areas, and clientele groups. And the various relationships between them we've talked about, these are essentially part of a permanent government of the United States that make public policy. And and then we talked about agency capture, and I'm going to do that relatively briefly again. Agency capture is one specific example of an iron triangle or a policy complex. Remember, you need to think about these things vertically rather than horizontally for the most part. Agency capture basically means that interest groups, that clientele groups, business groups, business corporations, business associations, industry associations end up controlling public policy outcomes. Many times, sub-governments or policy complexes are not cases of agency capture, but the ones that are those where the clientele groups have so much power that they're able essentially to control, in many instances, public policy in a specialized policy area. So we looked at the two examples of energy policy. One, the Energy Information Administration, where its budget was cut by the Congress such that it became overly reliant on information regarding energy produced by the energy corporations. And so if in other words, an agency or the Congress relies solely or primarily on information from the industry, obviously it's much more likely that public policy is going to reflect the interests of the sources of that information. Similarly, with regard to the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Caribbean in 2010, the Minerals Management Service, which was responsible, in theory, the federal agency responsible for overseeing the drilling, was virtually totally inept and unable to do its job according to federal laws and regulations. And we talked about this timeline. Now, one other example that is more a matter of debate among scholars, and that's the Defense Department. Some scholars argue that the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, is very much in control of the money and hence is in control of policy with respect to defense and defense contracts. The Boston Globe piece that I reference here suggested that no, the Pentagon really doesn't control. If you read through this whole piece, what does it say? What it says is the top military officials, generals, for example, when they retire, look for work. Well, what do generals know? What generals know, among other things, is military weapons and defense technology. And they end up being placed on the board of major corporations. So Lockheed Martin, for example, not the only one, but just as one poster child example of military contractors. Or they take high-level executive positions in these corporations, and then they return to the Pentagon to lobby, usually successfully, for weapons contracts. Why do weapons contracts matter? First of all, they're huge. Second of all, they're involving national security and national defense. Thirdly, they're very often cost overruns. Fourthly, they create jobs, and they create jobs in states and congressional districts, so congressmen like them. Creating jobs and defending the nation, quote unquote, are political winners, electoral winners for people in Congress. So I'm going to skip over this. This is all the good things that we've talked about, and there's a reference from governmentisgood.either.org or com by Douglas. I'm forgetting his last name, but a political scientist at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. So there are all kinds of important things that every day we don't even think about that federal policies do. And I don't want to minimize those. And again, I'd refer you to governmentisgood.com as one source of information about all the really useful things that the federal government does do. My job here is to talk less about that. I'm not a cheerleader. I'm trying to explain to you as best I can the systems of policy, structures, and relationships that are relatively impervious to the wishes and preferences of the American people, because the American people, frankly, aren't as well organized, nor do they have the level of resources available to focus, nor do they have, for example, the expertise I mean, how many of us know very much about energy policy? Energy corporations are going to know more. So, two lessons here, or two lesson slides. One is that government bureaucracies, like all of them, are complex, and they generally don't function quite as efficiently as what Max Weber envisioned. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not. But efficiency is maybe the rationale for bureaucracies, but they often don't achieve it for a number of reasons, some of which we talked about earlier. But federal bureaucracies also offer continuity and needed services that are essential to the working of American society and the welfare of the American people. The lessons of the Iron Triangle are, it seems to me, more clear, and that is, and more simple to understand. The actors in the Iron Triangles provide the most consistent, the most enduring, the most resourced, the most powerful political support for members of Congress and the agencies of the executive branch, and as a consequence, they dominate public policy and make it very difficult for the American people to really influence government policy, and usually, because the American people are not involved in enduring and ongoing ways, the outcomes of public policy may not, in fact, serve the best interests of the American people, more often than not. Comments or questions? I mean, maybe a simple analogy. And again, my wife hates my analogies, but I'll give it a shot. Let's say you have one sibling, and the sibling is, and of course always has been, older than you, and you live with your parents. And because your sibling can drive and you can't, your parents have decided that your older brother or sister should do the grocery shopping. And your parents have basically sloughed off, given the power of what we're going to buy this week in groceries to your older brother or sister. And you say, well, wait a minute, I don't like Brussels sprouts, and I don't like pork chops, and can we get something else rather than that? And I would like to participate in the formulation of the evening menu, the dinner menus every week. And your parents say, no, sorry, this is your older brother or sister's responsibility. You basically have no say. You can eat, or you can not eat, but this is how we're doing it. That may be a slight stretch in terms of being a little more extreme than the political reality, but not much. Any comments or questions? Okay. We're going to start on, let's see here, on the federal courts. By the way, while we're waiting, I mean, one of the lessons is that if the reason this happens is not because of necessarily some evil intent, but it's the difference between being organized to participate all the time in government or participating only occasionally or maybe infrequently. So the turnout, for example, nationally in the off-year elections earlier this month was about 37.5%. If I'm in office, if I'm in elective office, or I'm the head of some federal agency, keeping in mind that the election is maybe 53% or 52 or 51% to 47, 8 or 9%, and that's of the 37% who are participating. Why should I pay attention to that? There's no majority there. There's no majority voice of the American people, even in an election, let alone 3 weeks from now. If you're not permanently organized, if you are not permanently organized, if you do not have some identifiable expertise, and if you don't have very many resources, you will not play the game of politics very well. Okay. Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, starts us off. The judiciary, he said, has no influence over either the sword, military, or the purse, money. No direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no active resolution whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, merely judgment. Is an interesting quote, largely, it seems to me, true, though it's not uncommon for many Americans to rail against the federal courts as making policy and having no business making policy. So the Constitution provides that federal and Supreme Court judges are not elected and they serve for life, at least during good behavior. Keep in mind, again, that Congress creates all of the federal court system under the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is provided for in the Constitution. The federal court system, which falls underneath the Supreme Court and is administered by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is something that Congress created. Because the federal court justices have life terms, they are not elected. They are all appointed by the president, whoever was president at the time, and approved by the Senate of the United States. Because they're not elected, they have some degree of independence in a way that elected officials do not. They don't have to campaign for office. They don't have to run for, well, sometimes they do campaign to get a nomination, but once in, they don't have to campaign for re-election. The interesting thing about the federal courts and federal judges is, and we'll get to some of this in a minute, is that the judiciary is almost by definition a conservative political institution. I don't mean politically conservative in the sense of public policy. I mean not democratically elected, in office for life, and as we'll see, bound by a whole range of traditions, at least in theory bound by them, that constrains and dramatically limits any activism at all, compared to other political actors. One of the things this means is that federal judges can make very unpopular decisions that would be political suicide for those who run for office. they have more leeway, at least in theory, to protect minority rights and interests because they don't have to stand for re-election. A small percent, minorities don't normally dominate electoral outcomes. So on the one hand, you have a political institution which is intrinsically more conservative and, dealing, for example, with the law. What is the law? What is the basis for our rulings, the Constitution, the oldest, legal document in our country's history. So, when senators and congressmen go on TV, the first thing they talk about, the first thing they say is not, this is what the Constitution says I need to do. Okay, they say, Benghazi this, Affordable Health Care Act this. They don't talk about very often the Constitution, and when they do, it's usually for rhetorical purposes rather than any kind of duty that they have. So, perhaps the single most important case in the history of the Supreme Court is the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. The details of this case are not particularly important with respect to you and what you get out of this case. What's important is to understand that this was the first time ever in our history that the Supreme Court developed and utilized the concept of judicial review. The concept of judicial review means and is that the federal courts, in some limited cases, can exercise the power to render null and void an act of the executive branch and an act of Congress. So what Marbury and Madison did was establish the principle that the federal courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, can rule an act of the Congress or an act of the executive branch unconstitutional. Over the course of our history, this power of judicial review has been used with great modesty, meaning the federal courts and the Supreme Court have especially the Supreme Court, have rarely used, less than 100 times up through 1980, maybe half that many times, up through 1980, the power of judicial review to declare an act of the executive or Congress unconstitutional. In the past 30 years, Supreme Court rulings of unconstitutionality have been at unprecedented high levels. And this quote-unquote judicial activism, this growing number of decisions declaring acts of the legislature or the executive unconstitutional, has been associated not with liberals controlling the Supreme Court, but with conservatives controlling the Supreme Court. So the idea, one of the things this does is it gives the lie to those criticisms of judicial activism by conservatives, because the judicial activism, in fact, is as measured by the use of judicial review, which is the greatest power that the Supreme Court has, that power has been wielded by conservatives on the court. So what are the sources of American law? I'm listing 4 of them here. First, common law tradition. And one of the things that's important is the notion of precedent, or stare decisis. Our country is more than 200 years old. Over that period of time, there have built up a large number of rulings by the Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts. And the interpretations associated with those rulings presumably develop out of an interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, state constitutions, and federal law. So previous decisions, precedents, are an important source of American law, but also supposedly the number one source for decisions by the federal courts. The constitutions, both the federal and state constitutions, are important sources of law. The federal and state statutes and administrative regulations, and again, case law. So, in theory, what justices and courts are not supposed to do is make it up as they go along. They are supposed to refer to previous precedents, decisions, to the constitutions, to existing laws and administrative regulations as an important, critical framework for decisions in new cases. When precedent is overturned, that becomes an important case to know about. So, how do people get to the courts? When individuals or groups or NGOs, that's non-governmental organizations, businesses, governmental actors, dispute the meaning of words and phrases in constitutions and statutes and meet certain other criteria, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they have the right to ask judges to provide interpretations that will settle disputes. It's important to keep in mind, parenthetically, that we have three branches of government. You know this: judicial, legislative, and executive. There are those in American politics who argue that the rights of Americans should be more limited in terms of their ability to use the courts to deal with disputes or damages or problems in government and the society. They often argue that various lawsuits that they don't agree with are frivolous and therefore can be excluded from the court system. I might add that frivolous usually means either I don't agree with it or it doesn't represent my views or interests. When you bring a frivolous lawsuit and is deemed to be frivolous, you often have to bear all of the court costs associated with wasting the court's time. Even in cases where you're going to slap the palm of your hand on your forehead and say, "Really?" And if we have time at some point, I'll give you the poster child for that. But you bring a frivolous lawsuit and it's deemed to be so by the court, you're going to be out a pile of money. So that argument of restricting people's access to the courts, if I said to you, if a politician said, well, you don't really need to vote for your member of Congress or your senator. You don't really need to vote for president next time. You really shouldn't be allowed to do that. You'd look at them and say, what the hell are you talking about? It's no different than saying you really shouldn't have access to the courts if you have any kind of legitimate grievance. So we said earlier that courts are conservative institutions. What do we mean by that? We mean that courts generally are bound by legal traditions and culture. Their job is to identify when it is appropriate, legal solutions or remedies available under the Constitution and existing laws and regulations, remedies or solutions to those who are the plaintiffs, those who are aggrieved. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Courts are restrained supposedly by precedent, by the Constitution, by the facts of the case, and by the practices and rules of legal culture. Why do we say the courts are conservative? Judges are passive. Courts are largely passive in society's affairs. Why do I say that? Well, you've probably all heard of the perhaps somewhat unfair characterization of lawyers as ambulance chasers, running after people or conflicts or problems so that they can represent them, get a client, and make some money. Courts couldn't be more different. They are not activists by definition. They only get cases when other political actors bring those conflicts, issues, or harms, or claims of harm, to the courts. Courts do not look for problems to fix or wrongs to right. They sit on their butts with their clerks, their law clerks, and wait until somebody walks in the door. Okay? And there's a lot of folks walking in the door. But they don't go out looking for them. They're simply there, and everybody who's got a complaint has got to come to them. Courts rarely intervene to stop injustices. There must be a real, unresolved dispute, and the parties must have a stake in the outcome. They usually get into the act after alleged wrongs have already been committed and people have been harmed. So the court's scope of activity is radically limited. The federal courts have about 1% of all the court activity in the United States of America. State and local courts handle 99%. And the Supreme Court gives full review maybe to 1/10 of 1% of all the cases in the federal courts of appeals, and about 0.02% of all federal cases annually. The Supreme Court takes a very, 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 very small sliver of cases. So, how do you get into the federal court system? Well, first of all, with respect to the court, you've got to go to a court that has jurisdiction for your case. And court jurisdiction varies from one kind of court to another. And you have to have standing to sue. What does that mean? Well, I'll give you an example. You've got to show some harm. I'll give you an example. Let's say I am a religious person. I live in a school district. I'm a renter. Property taxes are used to pay for the public schools. I'm a renter. I have children. They go to the public school. Or maybe they don't. Let's say I don't have any children. But I'm in a school district. I don't really pay property tax because I'm a renter. And the school requires in science class the teaching of intelligent design or creation science, quote unquote, and the school board has eliminated any discussion of the theory of evolution the science curriculum. And let's say I happen to be a chemist who works for Procter & Gamble. So I understand a bit about science and the difference of not only what science is, but the differences between science and religion. And I find this objectionable, that science has been taken over by people with a specific religious orientation. And I say, this is totally intolerable. I'm going to bring a lawsuit against the school board and the school district. I probably don't have standing. What is the damage that I or my children have suffered? I'm a renter, so I don't really directly pay property tax. I don't have any children. I simply think that doing this is bad public policy and stupid education. Okay, I'm not saying that obviously I believe people have the right to believe anything they want. That's why we have churches and synagogues and mosques and so on. But it's not, that teaching is not consistent with what we know about the world. I have no basis to bring a case just because I disagree. I have to have suffered harms. And while I may feel that the community or the students or the teachers suffered harms, they're not me. So you need to have standing. Parties to lawsuits can be called plaintiffs. These are people who, or actors who initiate a lawsuit. Defendants, those who are being sued. And class action suits, which have been somewhat restricted, are brought by a class of individuals or actors who a class action suit is brought by multiple sanely situated plaintiffs. Here we have the Supreme Court of the United States as it is currently constituted. In the middle is John Roberts. He is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and one thing most Americans don't know, the Chief Justice is at the same time the responsible and legal administrator for the entire federal court system. This is a part of the federal court system that is not widely known or commented on nearly as much as, individual decisions by the federal courts and by the Supreme Court. So the current Supreme Court is unique in a number of ways. First of all, it has 3 women members, one of whom is Latina. There have only, to my knowledge, been 4 women members of the United States Supreme Court in our entire history. 4. 2 of them were appointed by President Obama. Second, there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court of the United States. I don't think this has ever been the case until now. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. Third, the court is deeply divided ideologically between conservatives and liberals, and Justice Kennedy is often the swing vote. 4, there have been an unusually high number of rulings that have found, by the Supreme Court, that have found acts of Congress unconstitutional. This is important because almost everybody involved in judicial politics, quote unquote, at the federal level, agrees that, including the justices who are up for confirmation before the Senate, that generally speaking, the federal courts and the Supreme Court should not be activist and should uphold the norm of judicial modesty and respect for the greater role of the other branches. In point of fact, this dance in the last 25 years has been full of disingenuous, if not outright lying behavior by the judicial candidates. Because the numbers show, empirically, we know that the number of times the Supreme Court has ruled acts of Congress unconstitutional is at all-time highs in our history. So what have the courts been doing, big picture? In a roughly 30-year period, the Supreme Court, 54 to 72, Supreme Court significantly expanded the civil rights and liberties of the American people. In the past 30 years, since Ronald Reagan was president, Supreme Court decisions have slowly eroded those accomplishments, most recently in the court's ruling that the sections of the Voting Rights Act are unconstitutional. Supreme Court has also acted to limit the powers of government to regulate business in order to protect the general welfare. And this conservative judicial philosophy has expanded or continued, maybe given additional impetus since 9/11. So where are we today? This will probably be the last slide because this looks like a good place to stop. The federal courts do have the authority to settle disputes between parties. Often one of those parties is a governmental entity. Their power to settle disputes is based on, again, the facts of the case and the application of the Constitution and relative laws to that case. In recent years, legislators and other political actors have sought to reorganize the courts to restrict their jurisdiction or citizens' access to them. And even worse, in the Senate of the United States, the parties have engaged in bitter conflict over nominations to the federal bench. So all this taken together is a sign, I believe, of substantial political division, partisan political division, that has what shall we say, has moved over from the legislative realm and elections into the federal courts. And so what we've been seeing in recent congressional sessions, actually, this goes back to the late 60s, the Senate has blocked presidential nominees, presidential appointments of federal judges, such that we now have, and have had for a number of years, historically high vacancies in the federal court system. That is, judicial vacancies, judge vacancies, that prevent the full and effective functioning of the federal courts. And not a few times the Chief Justice and other Supreme Court justices have argued that this is hurting the justice system in the United States. It has become very difficult now for president, certainly this current president, to nominate people to the federal bench and to even get a vote on the appointment, on the nomination. And in fact, the recent last point, the recent change of the filibuster procedure in the Senate addresses this issue. And the compromise that was developed in the Senate was that the filibuster would not be used for judicial nominees to the federal bench, but only to the Supreme Court. The bottom line is, and again, this goes back actually to the Johnson administration in the 1960s and his effort to appoint Abe Fortas as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The opening shot was in this whole partisan wrangling over judicial appointments to the federal bench started when the Republican Party blocked Justice Fortas' nomination in the late 60s. And it's just gone downhill from there. And to some degree, both parties have been doing it. The Republicans a bit more than the Democrats. We are out of time. We hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we will pick up with the federal courts next time. Please keep in mind you need to keep reading in the text and turning in your assignments and posting on the discussion board. Have a nice day. Have a good long holiday.
Yeah.